But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Welcome to episode 3 of the Exit Your Matrix show. It's good to have you back. I want to start, first of all, with a review of things that we've covered to date. And as a quick aside, one thing that we're going to be doing is repeating. We're going to be going back and talking about things because I think it's very helpful. I can tell you that from personal experience, I benefit from hearing terms repeated. They really seem to sink in when I hear them multiple times. So I'm going to go ahead and use that here. So bear with me if we do that. So first of all, truth. Simply defined, truth is what has already occurred and what is currently happening. So they are the things that we can observe in our reality around us. Again, very hard to argue with that definition of truth. The second is beliefs and axioms. And I want to talk about axioms in particular. Beliefs, I think, are fairly self-explanatory, but recall that we talked about axioms in a prior episode. And axioms are belief systems, they are ideas that we assume because we accept them to have already been proved to be true. We accept them as reality. And sometimes our beliefs and axioms obviously are not correct. So on the subject of beliefs, I want to start with a quote by Gustave Le Bon, born in 1841 and died in 1931. He was a leading French polymath whose areas of interest included anthropology, psychology, sociology, medicine, invention, and physics. He is popularly known for his 1895 work, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, which is considered one of the seminal works of crowd psychology. And he said, "The beginning of a revolution is in reality the end of a belief." We've also talked about knowledge and wisdom. And again, knowledge is just information. It's not necessarily true or untrue. It just is data. We have to be, of course, careful about the knowledge that we're taking in, the quality of it, and we have to know what the sources are and be very discerning about that. And wisdom is truth that is properly applied. And recall that we've talked about the concept of hearing the words or the phrase, knowledge is power. And I take exception with that. I think that knowledge is not necessarily power. It's potential power. It's got the possibility of becoming power, but wisdom is really power because wisdom is knowledge when it's properly applied in the world. We've also talked about solipsism, and this is a term referring earlier to repetition being important. I couldn't remember solipsism 2, 3, 4 times after hearing it, but about the 5th or 6th time it started to take, and now I can't forget the word solipsism. Remember, solipsism is the philosophical concept that the only thing that exists is one's own mind and what is in one's own mind. And so anything outside of one's mind is uncertain or potentially doesn't exist at all. We talked about the triune brain, and this is the concept that we have really 3 brains that are stacked, if you will, on top of one another. So we have a reptilian brain at the base, also called the R complex. And that controls our physical movements. It's basically our survival instincts, the things that we do to take care of ourselves and make sure that we don't become prey to others, and we can continue to live and prosper, procreate, etc. There's another important thing about the R complex, or the reptilian brain, and that is that it controls the fight or flight mechanism. So when we are in those situations where we are threatened, something is happening to us that is of major significance and seriousness, we have the decision to make of whether to fight or whether to flee. And if we decide to do either of those, we've already been stimulated. The R complex has already gone into motion, and it is moving blood to all of our extremities so that we can either fight, which is going to involve our hands and arms, or we take off, which is going to involve our legs. Then on top of that, we have the mammalian brain, or the limbic system, and this is also known as the emotional brain. So it controls our emotional reactions, our internal emotional regulation, etc. And then we have the neocortex, or the human brain, or the thinking brain, that's stacked on top of that. And that is really the higher order. That is our ability to understand ourselves, to contemplate things, to have inquisitive thought, basically to be able to separate ourselves from an idea and actually consider it from a third-party perspective. And it's also where consciousness is housed, and that's clearly a big part of this show, and clearly a big part of the message that I'm sending. We also talked about the left and right brains, and the left is more of a masculine aspect, deals with logic and reasoning, whereas the right hemisphere is the feminine aspect and deals with more holistic thinking and care, if you will. It's very important to understand when we talk about the left and right brains that balance is so important, and balance is important in all of the things that we talk about, interestingly enough, but very much so in these, and very much so balance between the three aspects of the brain being R complex, mammalian, and neocortex. Those also need to be in balance. But what we'll see is that the real area of focus here is left and right brain. Where those are in balance, we'll see some really magical things happen, but when they're not in balance, we'll also see some negative consequences, which we'll talk about today. We also talked about the three manifestations of consciousness. And so these are thought, emotions, and actions. And again, balance is so important. If we are not thinking and feeling and acting in a way that is symbiotic, that is balanced and basically three of one, then we will see negative consequences in our lives, and often that results in suffering. We also talked about two conditions that prevent us from attaining the kind of knowledge that we need to arrive at truth, and those are nescience and ignorance. And nescience is a condition where someone is simply unable. They lack the awareness, they lack the maturity in some cases to be able to understand certain things. So a simple example here is you take a child who doesn't understand what gravity is. They're just not old enough yet. They're a toddler, let's say. So they walk up to a cliff and they have no idea what's going to happen if they take one more step. But you take someone who is older and has that maturity, 16, 18, whatever the age is, and they certainly understand what gravity is. They certainly understand what will happen if they take that next step. But if we take ignorance, that is something altogether different, and that is the active or intentional avoidance of this information. And I think that's what we're facing more of today, is just folks who don't want to deal with this information. We also talked about the concept of shared consciousness. And most people, I think, will agree, some don't of course, that we have a consciousness. And I certainly believe that. But further, that we are part of a larger consciousness of humanity. And I think the proof of this is that it seems to bear out that when you have aggregate consciousness, in other words, individuals in large groups thinking a certain way, thinking, feeling, and behaving in a certain way, we see those impacts in the world, and we certainly see them on other people. As I think and feel and act has impacts on other people. But when you get these in very, very large groups, in the aggregate, it can have very meaningful impacts. So I want to talk now about a quote from Herbert Spencer, born in 1820 and died in 1903. He was an English philosopher, psychologist, biologist, anthropologist, and sociologist. Now, I'm going to be a little bit of a heretic here because he was famous for his hypothesis of social Darwinism, which, of course, I don't agree with. However, I think the quote is well placed and I think really exemplifies what we have been talking about, so I think it's fair game. He said, "No one can be perfectly free till all are free. No one can be moral till all are moral. No one can be happy till all are happy." So let's now move into some things that I want to talk about that are somewhat new. And the first is cause and effect. And this one's important because it is extremely critical to understanding and applying and what we're talking about. But it's also, I think, has a little bit of a personal impact to me that I think is a parallel. So I talked before when I introduced myself that I had started an awakening around 2010. And where I think I spent most of my time, especially in the latter years before I moved on to what I'm interested in now and talking about in this show, is the effects side of things. I was focused on what is happening in the world, what events are happening in the world, and seeking people to help me understand what was really going on and what was really happening, but within those micro circumstances. I wasn't really focused yet, or didn't know to focus on the macro. And really the macro, in my opinion, are the causes. All those effects, all those individual situations, all those pieces of news that were occurring certainly had causes. And I think where we are as individuals, when we become accustomed to media as being our primary outlet or wherever we're getting our information, we're focused constantly on effects. Well, this is happening in the world, and so we go and we find the thing that we think is going to impact that the most, and they're still in the effects side of the equation, I would call it. We really don't stop to take the time to understand what is truly causing those things, and they're almost always not the cause. The second thing is that we really have to focus on the goal of this whole exercise being trying to get more and more people, greater numbers of people, attaining higher levels of consciousness. So more and more people aligning their left and right hemispheres of their brains, balancing thoughts, emotions, and actions. Again, balance is the critical issue here. And as we do that, that will allow us to be able to discover truth. Finding who we are and understanding our consciousness and growing that consciousness is the key ingredient and a critical prerequisite to being able to attaining and understanding truth. And I'd also like to go in now and show you a quote from Sun Tzu, whose birth name, by the way, was Sun Wu, was a Chinese military general, strategist, philosopher, and writer who lived between 771 and 256 BCE. He said, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear for the result of 100 battles." I mentioned earlier that we're going to be repeating some things, and something I didn't talk about up till now, but I should have, is the fact that what we're really doing in these early episodes is talking about foundational material. So talking about how the brain works, truth, wisdom, consciousness, solipsism, all of these ideas are so important to lay kind of a bedrock of what we are going to go to in the future, which are things like natural law and morality and those bigger concepts. But we've got to get through this material first and have a solid footing. Finally, I know this work is tedious and probably not very popular. Again, I talked about in a prior episode that I would call this information the most inconvenient truth because in a lot of ways it's entirely inconsistent with how we live and certainly points in a direction that we could look at it and say, are we living in the right way? Are we behaving in a right way? Are we organizing ourselves in a way that's most beneficial for us to thrive and be fulfilled as human beings? But despite that, what I do want to share, and I had some feelings like this over the past week because I was doing some research and I really got a kind of a burst of energy from some of the information and some things I'm finding. There is a world of information and knowledge out there that probably you don't know about. Certainly, I can tell you I didn't. And as I'm finding it, it is, and I've probably overused this word, but it's fascinating. I'm really captivated by this. It's incredible, the thinkers where I'm getting this information from and where this knowledge is coming from. They're some of the most amazing figures that I've come across, and their writings and their videos and other works are really, really impactful. So I would just tell you to just take a deep breath and understand that yes, it's a little heavy. It's not the most fun thing to talk about. But there are some things in here, there are some illuminating features of this information that if you'll just give it some time and if you'll just delve into it a little bit, I really think that you'll find the same thing and you'll really enjoy it. On the subject of knowledge and information, I will again, and I think I'm going to put this up pretty much in every episode, I would highly urge you to go to Mark Passio's website, whatonearthishappening.com, and take him up on this offer that he has made to send you back a drive that you provide him with 2 full terabytes of information. They're audio files, books, and videos. And if you are interested in learning more about this and really educating yourself on all of these things that I'm talking about, and what I'm talking about is just the tip of the iceberg, there's so much there, you should go get this. It is absolutely amazing. So please do that. You'll really be happy you did. So I'd like to start today with a video clip from a podcast. This is a new one that I just found recently. The podcast name is On the Edge with Andrew Gold, and his guest is Dave Whitehead. Very interesting discussion. Dave was on basically to talk about the Great Reset, if you're familiar with that, and what the World Economic Forum is talking about. This is kind of the follow-on to One World Government. It's now basically being called the Great Reset. But in any case, the content aside, they got into a really interesting discussion about freedom and whether people really want to be free. And I thought it was really insightful. The 2 guys had some interesting perspectives, and I think that there's validity in both of them. But let's take a look at what they had to say, and then I'll comment here in a second. And by the way, Andrew is going to be on the left-hand side, and his guest is going to be on the right-hand side.
I think the only place I slightly disagree is that it's just human nature. I think just history shows us that we don't appreciate freedom. And maybe I'm not even disagreeing. I think maybe you agree on that as well. Most people don't appreciate freedom. They don't look at what has been fought for.
They're going to say humans don't have free will. Therefore, we need to have an unelected elite establishment rule micromanage every fine detail of your life for you. I'm frightened by the amount of people that would buy into that, but I also understand that they've been bombarded since their youth, since they were born. Because remember, these agendas we're talking about have been going on since well before you and I got to this planet, right? In my opinion, if you have any connection to the principle of freedom whatsoever, you're going to be up in arms about it, and you're going to be researching it and trying to learn more. Because in my opinion, the future doesn't look bright in a world that is absent freedom. It only looks like every dystopian science fiction movie you've ever seen. You know what I mean?
All right. So before I provide any of my thoughts on what the 2 individuals had to say there, I want to read an excerpt from an essay. It wasn't a book. It's essay length. And it's called The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude by a French writer named Etienne de la Boissy. It is incredible how as soon as a people becomes subject, it promptly falls into such complete forgetfulness of its freedom that it can hardly be roused to the point of regaining it, obeying so easily and so willingly that one is led to say, on beholding such a situation, that this people has not so much lost its liberty as won its enslavement. It is true that in the beginning men submit under constraint and by force, but those who come after them obey without regret and perform willingly what their predecessors had done because they had to. This is why men born under the yoke and then nourished and reared in slavery are content, without further effort, to live in their native circumstance, unaware of any other state or right, and considering as quite the nature and condition in which they were born. There is, however, no heir so spendthrift or indifferent that he does not sometimes scan the account books of his father in order to see if he is enjoying all the privileges of his legacy, or whether, perchance, his rights and those of his predecessor have not been encroached upon. Nevertheless, it is clear enough that the powerful influence of custom is in no respect more compelling than this, namely, habituation to subjugation. So I think this was an interesting dialogue, and you have Andrew on one hand questioning whether or not people really want to be free, and Dave, his guest, essentially saying that, well, if they're educated enough and if they understand enough about themselves and their environment, they will desire freedom. They always desire freedom. But I think what I just read you clearly indicates that we have an innate thing about us that has us desiring to be controlled. And I know that sounds like it's crazy and probably flies in the face of being an American, and we fought for our freedom, and we want freedom and civil liberties and all of these things. But I think it's critical to understand that we have this thing in human nature that has us look to others to give us, to provide for our needs, and we have a tendency to do those things. So I just wanted to point that out. I thought it was a great interaction, and certainly to the point of what we're talking about. So let's move on now to the hemispheric brain functioning. In other words, the left and right portions of our brain and how they interact, and what happens when they don't function well and when they do function well. So if we have a situation where we are predominantly engaged in the outside world through the left brain, what happens is that the right brain suffers. What we also see is that other complexes within the brain recognize that there is an imbalance, that left brain is dominating, and they see that they need to take over. And so what we have in that particular case is the limbic brain, the emotional brain that we talked about in the center. It suffers the most. And so you'll have people basically shutting down emotionally. And then we move into, because those two portions of the brain are not functioning correctly, well, the R complex, or the reptilian brain, senses that and springs into action. And so you have someone who is very unemotional, very emotionally unaware, and very much in a fight or flight or reptilian mode. Conversely, when we have someone who is predominantly using their right brain to interact with and interpret the outside world, what we see is they become highly spiritual, and even to the point where they can have challenges being rooted in reality. We also see them exhibit signs of avoiding negativity. Anything negative or negative information they want to have nothing to do with. That can lead to escapism, which is very concerning, because it's just an avoidance of what is going on in the objective reality in the world around them. And then when the right brain dominates, if it gets to that point, the limbic system takes over. So this is the mammalian or center portion of our brain structure. And we have people either living in fear or they become too passive. And so you have the reptilian part of the brain shut down, and what results is a runaway emotional state because the limbic system is in control. Let's now talk about worldviews that result when we have chronic imbalance either to the left or right brain. And worldview, by the way, is just that. It's how we as individuals see the world around us, how we view the world around us. So if we have chronic left brain dominance, what we see is the person becomes dominant. They want to control others, and they want to control others' actions. And we can see this escalate to the point where these people become physically aggressive if they don't get their own way. Ultimately, this results in the type of brain imbalance that's called master or order giver. When someone is dominant to the right brain and we have an imbalance in that direction, what results is the person becomes very submissive. They have feelings of self-loathing. They have feelings of unworthiness. And we can often see that this escalates towards addictive tendencies. And this is the slave or order follower mindset that results ultimately. And victims of authority-based mindsets are vulnerable to mind control, which we'll talk about at length when we go forward. But this is very important because I think so many people are in that mode of being controlled by societal influences, by friends and consensus and family and all of the things that are around us that push us a certain way, but we're in a mode and in a mindset that leads to that. So speaking of the master and slave mindsets, I found a video by Michael Tsarian that I want to play for you that I think is really interesting because it talks and alludes earlier to what we were talking about in the podcast episode where the two guys were talking about, do people really want freedom? Do they somehow maybe subconsciously desire slavery? And Michael really takes that subject on and has some interesting comments about the relationship between master and slave and what the slave might be doing to empower the master. So let's take a look.
You can't continually be talking about tyrannies as if it is a gun to the head, and we're being forced and coerced all the time. Sooner or later, we're going to have to ask us a more deeper question. What is it that the slave is doing to not only bring about his own enslavement, but perhaps to even bring into being the enslavers? Because ultimately, I believe that this master-slave thing is a relationship. It is in our relationships on the intimate domestic level, and it is further up the fractal. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of pointing out who the enemy is, and that's very valid and important. We need to do that. But I approach a lot of this stuff from an occult tradition, from a philosophical point of view, never forgetting that there's a relationship here between the parasite and the host. Basically, we're asking a question. And that is man accepting tyranny in all its forms, both in intimate life and further up the fractal? Are we accepting that because we'd rather have external tyranny in any form than walk the road of selfhood? Now, I don't know. I say we're exploring it together. Is man so afraid of the burden, the weight of being a self? Is he so apprehensive about walking the Siddhartha road, or he tries it and finds out, oh, Jesus, that's a bit tough, that he then makes this sort of inner contract with himself to follow the gurus and to follow the leaders and the masters so that these tyrants, both political and religious, exist?
So if we pause for a minute, I want to introduce something called the temple in man, or really the temple in you. And that is our mind. I want to use that terminology. And it's really a temple because it is the most precious gift we have been given by whatever you want to call it. God, creator, intelligence, the universe. The term really doesn't matter. That is completely unimportant. We have it. We know we have it. And I think we're misusing it. And we are not deploying it to its full potential. And it's so critical to think of it in terms of a temple. It really is that. It's not just this physical structure that has neurons firing and cells and blood flow. It's so much more than that. And when we don't take care of it, when we don't give it the kind of care it needs, it can and will malfunction, and it'll lead to a lot of suffering. I want to move now to a structure in the brain that is very interesting, a bit mysterious, and that is the pineal gland. And as you can get from the word pineal, it's a cone-shaped structure in the center of our neocortex, like right behind our eyes. And I want to talk about this in the context of when the left and right brains are functioning as they should. They're in balance. We don't have the imbalance that we talked about before and some of those negative worldviews that result. So when we have the left and right brain in balance, one not dominant over the other, we have the neocortex, that thinking highest portion of our brain, and it is serving its intended purpose. It's triggered into becoming the command center of our brain, as it should. So then you don't have the person governed either by the R complex, where the left brain is dominant, or the limbic system, or mammalian brain, where we have the right brain being dominant. Where we have this left and right brain balance, we also have an individual who is neither a master of others nor a slave to others. They become the master of themselves. And we can call this ultimately self-rule or sovereignty. That's the word that I prefer. You'll also hear people talk about dominion as a word. Liberty, you'll hear that as well. Liberty and freedom are used synonymously sometimes, although I think they do have a different connotation. We'll get into that later. But in any case, I think what we're ultimately going to and aiming for as a state of consciousness is sovereignty, self-rule, self-control, self-governance. And in this, we also have those three aspects of consciousness that we've talked about coming into alignment. And again, those three being in balance. So as we think, so we feel, and so we act. And as far as the pineal gland is concerned, when all of this is happening, the pineal gland does something magical, really. And what it is it becomes active, and it influences our entire state of awareness of what's going on around us, and it creates a sense of discernment. And that is a critical, critical word. I'm pretty sure I used that in the first episode when I asked you to be discerning about information, specifically knowledge that you're taking in. Be discerning about what it is and the sources that you get it from. I also want to revisit the concept of solipsism. And again, this is most commonly expressed in the term of perception is reality. And why this is so dangerous is that it places in an individual the role of determining what truth is based on their own personal experience and preferences. So it becomes so dangerous because then we have individuals who see themselves as the arbiter of truth and not truth being the arbiter of truth. And solipsism can have some very negative outcomes. When we have somebody in a solipsistic mindset, they obviously don't see truth outside of their own mind. And if they can't observe and determine truth, then if there's no truth, there's no God. No God means atheism. And that can be a very scary thing, even though at one point in my life, I believed that I was an atheist after struggling with some religious and spiritual issues for a long time in my life. But I'm now past that, and I understand the negative connotations of being atheist, because you do have to have a spiritual component to all of this to be able to really ascertain truth and to be able to incorporate it into your life. The second thing is moral relativism. So this is the idea that there is no such thing as objective right or wrong. There's no such thing as objective morality. Again, you have someone who is determining what is moral based upon their own preferences and their own circumstances. And finally, more broadly, these can be very, very dangerous in terms of resulting in social Darwinism, eugenics, and totalitarianism. And those subjects we'll get into at much greater length in the future. The thought from Michael Tessarian. He said that we have to become profoundly critical and judgmental, and then our innate spirit of rebellion comes alive, and without it, we're sheep. Which reminds me of this. And this is actually a picture of a t-shirt that I have. Finally, I want to close with a quote from Walt Whitman. And I think this is great. I think I may start reading this every day. But it's a really nice synopsis, I think, of what we should be thinking about and how we should live our lives. This is what you should do. Love the earth and sun and the animals. Despise riches. Give alms to everyone that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Devote your income and labor to others. Hate tyrants. Argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Take off your hat to nothing, known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss what insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall become a great poem. Thanks for being here. Be well, and remember, do your own thinking. See you next time.